next speaker is Professor Gopal K. Gupta. So Professor Gopal K. Gupta, his talk is on Canon and Charisma in Gaudiya Vaisnava Vedanta. Professor Gupta is a Vaisnava philosopher and Joy Dunham Distinguished Professor of Ethics at Aurora University. Previously, he was a Professor of Philosophy and Religion at the University of Evansville. Professor Gupta is the Editor-in-Chief of Journal of Hindu-Christian Studies. He is the author of scholarly book, Maya, in Bhagavad Purana. This book explores Maya's rich conceptual history and then focuses on highly developed theology of Maya found in Sanskrit Bhagavad Purana. So we have been listening to Professor Gopal many times. I'm so fortunate to have all my three speakers so lucid, so polite in their words and their the pronunciations. It's always lucid, and that too when they talk about the Vedanta. But the topic he has chosen is the Canon and Charisma in Gaudiya Vaishnava Vedanta. That is really a very loaded topic, the Canon. Before inviting Professor Gupta, because he is the final speaker in this session, I just want to remember two verses from Chaitanya Charitamrita. The canon of the Vedanta, at the time of Lord Chaitanya, we can say that Sarabhama Bhattacharya was the canon. And the bigger canon came when Lord Chaitanya met him. Then Sarabhama Bhattacharya said that Nirantar यहाँ के वेदांत सुनाइब वैराग्य अद्वैत मार्गे प्रवेश कराइब. So what he says that now I will teach Vedanta to Lord Chaitanya and make him vairagya, and he will make him enter into the Advaita Marga. In the end, Sarabhama Bhattacharya says and falls to the feet of Lord Chaitanya, and he says that Tarka Shastre Jada Ami Aiche Lauha Pind Ama Dravaile Tume Pratap Prachanda. So the bhakti, the essence of the bhakti is such that all tarka, all logic is thrown away. So I think we are ready to listen to Professor Gopal on the Canon and Charisma of Gaudiya Vaishnava Vedanta. So welcome, Professor Gopal. The floor is yours. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
Namaste. Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here at this international conference. Such distinguished speakers. And it's especially difficult to speak after Professor Graham Schweig. Such an illuminating presentation. Yes, it is 11:15 at night here. So it looks a little dark, and it is a bit dark here at this, at this part of the world. And thank you for the organizers for organizing such a wonderful and illuminating event. So the Bhagavad Purana and the Vaishnava Vedanta, particularly the Gaudiya Vaishnava Vedanta, are very closely interrelated. It's literally impossible to speak about one or the other in isolation, because in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, the Bhagavad Purana is considered to be the commentary on the Vedanta Sutra by the acclaimed author, Vyasa. The tradition itself believes that Vyasa is the author of both the Vedanta Sutra and the Srimad Bhagavatam. So the Gaudiya Vaishnava Vedanta and the Vaishnava Vedanta is intrinsically connected with the Bhagavad Purana. So therefore, the Bhagavad Purana is considered to be a Vedantic text and also a Sankhya text. It combines both Sankhya and Vedanta, and it intertwines it in its discussion. And it's this, you could say, embrace of the Bhagavad Purana that adds charisma to the canon. Now, in the Gaudiya Vaishnava history, one of the teachers, scholars of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Baladev Vidyabhushan, did write a commentary on the Vedanta Sutra, which is known as the Govinda Bhashya. And this commentary, the Govinda Bhashya, is very extensive, actually. If you just in terms of the size, if you put it next to other commentaries on the Vedanta Sutra by Madhvacharya, Ramanujacharya, it's quite extensive, very elaborate. And this commentary was written in the late 15th, 16th centuries in response to the challenge that was posed by the Ramanandis against the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition that, look, you don't have a commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. And therefore, because you don't have a commentary on the Vedanta Sutra, we don't accept you as a genuine Vedantic school of thought, a Vedantic tradition. So Baladev Vidyabhushan thought deeply over this. He consulted his own teachers, his guides, and he was trained in the Madhva Sampradaya before sort of joining Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's movement. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, is the founder of the Gaudiya Vaishnava movement. He belonged to the Madhva Sampradaya. Being trained in that very strict discipline of Vedanta, he thought, well, if we don't have a commentary, then I myself will write a commentary. And as tradition tells us, within 7 days, he writes an entire commentary on the Vedanta Sutra, and that becomes the Govinda Bhashya, the commentary which is celebrated today as the Chaitanya Vaishnava commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. While that commentary is there, and a very elaborate and impressive commentary, still the Bhagavad remains the central commentary for the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. And the Bhagavad Purana is a very unique text because it synthesizes various traditions and brings them together into a very beautiful presentation. As you know, the Bhagavad is acclaimed as one of the greatest works in Sanskrit poetry, in philosophy, one of the most popular texts. And the Bhagavata's special quality is its capacity to synthesize different traditions. It synthesizes, as I mentioned, Vedanta, Pancharatra, Sankhya, Vaisheshika, and Nyaya, and then adds to that the devotional, ecstatic bhakti tradition of the South Asian Alvars and of the Northern Bhakti schools as well, and gives us Vedanta imbued with Bhakti. So this is a very unique subject matter. And as I mentioned, another key point that the Bhagavata is also Sankhya text. So it also takes the Sankhya conception of Prakriti and adds that into sort of synthesizes that with the Maya of Vedanta. So my work itself focuses on Maya and the concept of Maya in the Bhagavad Purana, as interpreted, as understood by the Gaudiya Vaishnava commentators and scholars. I have a book published on this topic, Maya in the Bhagavad Purana, Human Suffering and Divine Play, that's been published by Oxford University Press, USA, and Oxford University Press, India. Please feel free to get your copy on Amazon India. It's available. And so I will now read a short paper that I prepared for today that focuses, given this introduction, focuses on the Vedanta found in the Bhagavad Purana, which, when systematized, is the Vedanta of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. Gaudiya Vedanta is essentially the Bhagavad Purana's Vedanta systematized. So this is what we will try to do here. So here I begin. Many scholars agree that the Bhagavad Purana is an unambiguous Vaishnava text, meaning that it is clearly a personalist, monotheistic work. As such, the Bhagavata's primary aim is to convey knowledge about the following subjects. 1. The nature of Krishna, the fundamental name for the Bhagavata's supreme being. 2. the nature of the Purushas or the Jivatmas, the individual selves that are eternal infinitesimal emanations from that Supreme Being. And 3, the nature of both the temporal and the absolute realms, along with their subdivisions in which the various categories of living beings reside. So the Bhagavata talks about the traditional 3 categories of Vedanta, which is Ishvara, or Prakriti, and Jiva. Within the framework of these 3 features of ultimate reality, Gaudiya Vaishnava commentators have noted that the Bhagavata is concerned with 3 additional categories of understanding. And these are very important. These are very apparent and relevant throughout the work. The first is Sambandha, the relationship between Krishna and the individual selves. The second is Abhidhaya, the activity pertaining to that relationship. And the third is Prayojana, the fruit or object of such activity. In his essay, the Bhagavata, so Sambandha, Abhidhaya, and Prayojana, in relationship with Vedanta and Bhakti. In his essay, the Bhagavata, its philosophy, its ethics, and its theology, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who lived from 1838 to 1914, a prominent 19th century Gaudiya Vaishnava author, describes Krishna as a supreme absolute person, Krishna's absolute realm as an eternal transformation of Maya acting internally, the phenomenal realm as a temporary product of Maya acting externally, and the individual selves, the Purushas, as marginal in the sense that they have minute independence, freedom of will, and the capacity to choose. In other words, Krishna's eternal infinitesimal emanations are considered marginal because they can choose to reside in either the absolute realm, where they can pursue loving devotion to Krishna, or the temporal realm of birth and death, where they can pursue their own ends, what Bhaktivinoda calls active hostility. This brings us back to our discussion of Sambandha, relationship, Abhidhaya, activity, and Prayojana, or the fruit. Since it is said that the way we approach Krishna, the type of relationship we establish with God, leads to different type of activity, Abhidhaya, which in turn leads to a different type of fruit or end, Prayojana. Here we are concerned with the pursuit of our own ends on the one hand, and the loving service bhakti on the other. The absolute realm that is said to be a transformation of Yoga Maya, Krishna's internal energy, meaning the realm in which Krishna personally resides, along with his loving associates, those souls that want to live in full knowledge and remembrance of Krishna, Sambandha, that have chosen loving devotional service bhakti as the means, Abhidhaya, and that have found complete fulfillment and ultimate joy in wholly and unconditionally dedicating themselves to Krishna's happiness, Prayojana. However, before journeying into that divine realm, we must first develop more nuanced understanding of the term bhakti as we find it in the Bhagavad Purana. In Viraha Bhakti, Freedom Hardy points that the Bhagavata presents 2 distinct forms of bhakti: a normative bhakti, which is quiet contemplation, and an emotional bhakti, an intense form of bhakti directed toward Krishna. In Hardy's view, while the normative form is found in the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata, the Bhagavata's emotional form is not found in this work. While this understanding of the Gita's presentation of bhakti seems largely correct, there are nonetheless a small number of Gita verses that hint at something more than mere quiet contemplation. So the observation is that the Bhagavata takes the bhakti of the Gita, which is more argued to be quiet contemplation, and adds another dimension to it, which is in terms of ecstatic devotion, ecstatic bhakti. Within many Gaudiya Vaishnava traditions, there is the understanding that because God is absolute, he is fully present in his descriptions of his names, forms, qualities, activities, and words. Thus it is said that whenever sincere bhakti practitioners gather together to recite, discuss, and exchange ideas, Krishna becomes directly manifest. Quickening feelings of ecstatic love, accompanied by shivering of the body, flows of tears from the eyes, and other such symptoms. In the Gita's 10th chapter, Krishna appears to describe just such bhaktas, declaring that their thoughts dwell in him, that their lives are completely dedicated to him, and that they derive great satisfaction and bliss, tushyanti cha ramanti cha, by always speaking of him and exchanging realizations about him. So, while we find a few descriptions like this in the Gita, we find a more intimate and spontaneous form of bhakti found in the Bhagavad Purana. Perhaps it is the placement of the word quiet before the word contemplation in Hardy's description that seems somewhat delimiting. In chapter 28 of the Bhagavata's third book, Kapila Dev offers a more detailed description of the same yoga process that is briefly described by Krishna in the Gita's 6th chapter. At the end of this description, in verse 24, Kapila Dev notes that the yogi who properly follows the meditative path gradually develops pure love, bhava, for Hari and Krishna, Hari or Krishna, from which arises a melting of the heart and a joy so extreme that while meditating, one's hairs stand on end and tears of love constantly flow from one's eyes. A contemplative state that sounds anything but quiet. Regardless of what one may think of Hardy's normative/emotional division, which certainly has his discursive merits, a brief exploration of what the Bhagavad itself has to say about the levels and types of bhakti will likely garner tremendous reward. So with this understanding of bhakti, I now want to turn more to the idea of Vedanta in the Bhagavad Purana. In his English translation of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, a 16th century hagiography of the life and teachings of Chaitanya, Krishnadas describes Yogamaya's function as it relates to the sentiment of the gopis, and in doing so strikes at the very heart of the misunderstandings that often surround this topic, at least from the perspective of the Chaitanya school and even the Bhagavad itself. Yogamaya is the name of the internal potency that creates a spiritual sentiment in the minds of the damsels of Raja, by which they think of Lord Krishna as their paramour. This sentiment is never to be compared to mundane illicit love. It has nothing to do with sexual psychology, although the pure love of such devotees seems to be sexual. One should know for certain that nothing can exist in this cosmic manifestation that has no real counterpart in the spiritual field. All material manifestations are emanations of the transcendence. The erotic principles of amorous love, reflected in mixed material values, are perverted reflections of the reality of spirit. But one cannot understand the reality unless one is sufficiently educated in the spiritual science. This quote contains two key Bhagavata notions that will be further discussed below. One, the notion of the absolute realm as the object and the temporal realm as a reflection. And two, the notion of love as opposed to lust. Gaining a better understanding of the Bhagavata's perspective on these two ideas should lay the groundwork for discussions on the relationship between Krishna and Prakriti and the Jivas. The Bhagavata several times employs the metaphor of reflection or abhasa to illustrate the relation and the distinction between the absolute and temporal realms, with the former being the object and the latter being the reflection. Here we intend to revisit this metaphor, but in far greater detail and with a particular aim in mind. The Oxford Living Dictionary defines a reflection as an image seen in a mirror or shiny surface. In terms of the discussion at hand, we focus on one particular image. Imagine a small lake on a clear, sunny, cloudless day, without a trace of wind to be found. Imagine that just on the shore of the lake stands a banyan tree, with its root system exposed above ground. Looking into the lake, on such a day, one finds an almost perfect reflection of that tree. So please note that this metaphor of the reflected tree is found both in the Bhagavad Gita and in the Bhagavad Purana, in the third book, in the third canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Showing sort of the continuity between these two texts, how the Gita and the Bhagavata both serve as the Vedantic basis of the Gaudiya tradition. Looking into the lake on such a day, one finds an almost perfect reflection of that tree, a temporary manifestation that will endure only so long as the sun continues to remain in a particular position in the sky. And this is the metaphor of the upside down tree. But there's a peculiarity about this image, which is here important to note. Looking toward the tree and its image from the opposite shore, we can see that the reflected tree is inverted, meaning that the very top of the shore tree appears as the reflected tree's very bottom, and the very bottom of the shore tree appears as the reflected tree's very top. In other words, from the top to the bottom and everything in between, the reflected tree is a reverse image of the shore tree. This phenomena is used analogically by Gaudiya Vaishnava commentators to help us understand the relation between the absolute and the temporal realms, much as did Plato's comparison of objects and their shadows. Here, three things are important to note. The first thing is that all forms in the reflection, the roots, trunk, branches, twigs, perhaps a couple of birds sitting in the tree, did not just arise from nothing. Everything in the reflected tree is there because and only because it is there in the shore tree. The shore tree being, in every meaningful way, the basis of the reflected tree. Again, the reflected tree did not just appear from nothing, nor could it obtain with nothing as its basis. So a very important point here that I want to emphasize is that both Advaita Vedanta and the Bhagavad Purana and Gaudiya Vaishnava Vedanta use the same metaphor of the reflected tree, the abhasa, to establish their principles of Vedanta. Shankara uses that metaphor to establish his philosophy of Anirvachaniya, that the reflection neither exists nor does it not exist. But Shankara's use of that metaphor is not, you could say, his original use. The metaphor of abhasa has been used in the Upanishads, in the epics, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, long before Shankara. So this is a particular understanding of the metaphor of abhasa that Shankara uses. Now the Bhagavata also uses that same metaphor, but it does so without knowledge of Shankara's Anirvachaniya. It uses that reflection of metaphor in the way that the earlier texts use them, and it uses that reflection of metaphor to describe a relationship that is the relationship of the dependence of the world in relation to God. So not to illustrate the principle of Anirvachaniya, but rather the reflection exists, but it exists intrinsically in dependence with the object itself. The reflection is a metaphor to understand the world and its relationship with God. But the understanding that it gives is that just like the reflection is intrinsically, inherently dependent upon the object that it reflects, the world has no independence in of itself. The world is inherently dependent upon the object. Furthermore, just like the reflection is seen and not seen, that is, it is temporary, and in that sense unreal. In the same way, the world is real, but it is unreal only in the sense that it is temporary. So just like the reflection appears and disappears, the world is manifest and unmanifest. It is created and destroyed. But just because it is created and destroyed doesn't mean that it is unreal, but rather it means that its existence is inherently temporary and unreal in the sense that it is temporary. A knowledgeable person seeing only the reflected tree would logically assume the existence of the sure tree. So the reflected tree didn't appear out of nothing. This is the first thing that it illustrates. Nor could it obtain with nothing as its basis. Also, a knowledgeable person will see that the reflected tree assumes the existence of a real tree. So this world is reflecting something that is permanent and real. And the reflected tree, as I mentioned, is short-lived and temporary, whereas the sure tree, the actual tree, continues to exist long after the reflected tree disappears. And finally, the third thing is that all the values of the sure tree are reversed in the reflected tree. So this material world is real, but it is a perverted and upside down reflection of the original tree. The highest values in the sure tree are the lowest values in the reflected tree. At this point, the analogy should be relatively clear. The existence of this temporal world, its particular appearance, forms, relationships, etc., is based upon the existence of an absolute world of which it is a reflection. How do we know the temporal world is a reflection? Because of its temporary nature. How do we know its basis on a more permanent reality? In the same way we know the existence of the reflected. In the same way we know that the existence of the reflected tree signals the existence of the sure tree. Here, of course, is where the analogy departs from the thing we are attempting to explain, as must all analogies to one degree or another. The difference is this. In the analogy, the reflected tree is temporary, but its basis, the sure tree, is also ultimately temporary, and in this sense is also a reflection. To avoid an infinite regress, one must posit an absolute realm that has no beginning and no end, a realm, in other words, of beginninglessness, endless, irreducible form. And indeed, this is precisely what the Bhagavata posits. The temporal world appears as it does, with its particular forms, objects, creatures, etc., because it is a reflection of an absolute counterpart, an absolute alternate universe, one might say. Moreover, the relationship between human beings in the temporal world, between parents and children, friends and friends, husbands and wives, lovers and lovers, etc., appear as they do because they are reflections of the relationships in the absolute world. The temporary reflection is based on the absolute object. But remember, like the reflected tree, as compared to the sure tree, the values of the temporal world are inverted reflections of those that subsist in the absolute world. The pure love of the absolute realm, now bringing this back to bhakti, which we started with, the highest pinnacle of love of God, will naturally resemble its reflected counterpart in the temporal world. How could it be otherwise? Yet according to the Bhagavata, there's a world of difference between the two, a difference that the Bhagavata wants us to particularly understand with respect to the love of the gopis for Krishna and his love for them. Like the inverted values of the tree reflected in the water, that which constitutes the topmost expression of selfless love in the absolute realm is said to constitute the bottommost form of selfish lust and immoral betrayal in the temporal realm, breaking up hundreds of thousands of marriages each year. This brings us to the second notion mentioned at the beginning of what I was talking about, the need to draw a distinction between the love of the absolute realm, which in its highest expression can superficially appear like lust, and the lust of the temporal realm, which is often misleading and identified as love. As noted in our beginning discussion on bhakti, the second chapter of the Bhagavata's first book identifies ceaseless, unmotivated love of God expressed through concrete acts of devotion as that which can fully satisfy the self. In the same chapter, Vyasa recommends a simple method of cutting the karmic knot. In Canto 1, Chapter 2, Text 15, cleansing the heart of mundane desire, 1-17, nullifying the hurtful effects of passion and ignorance, 1-19, becoming free from bondage and illusion, and gradually developing an attachment for devotional association with God, with Krishna, 1-20. In this case, the means and the end appear to be the same. By associating with Krishna through hearing about, speaking about, remembering, and worshipping him, one is said to develop an increasing desire for Krishna's association, which gradually culminates in the full revival of one's dormant love for Krishna and constant devotional activity on his behalf. In Vaishnava circles, the word love has a very restrictive, even idealized meaning. According to the Bhagavata, only that love which is completely unadulterated, without a trace of personal desire, selfish motive, or exploitiveness, deserves to be called love. Anything less, regardless of degrees, is said to constitute kama, or selfish desire, or lust. Okay, so I will stop here. If there's any further comment or question, we can discuss that. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much, Gopal Hari Prabhu. It's really exciting to hear you every time. So we're really pleased. Your reflections on Gaudiya Vaishnava Canon, it's really enlightening. Maybe we'll sometime